Hello, and welcome to Essence of Wonder, again without Gaudy Everon. I'm Alan Bond, and this is Karen Castelletti. This week we're continuing our coverage of the Hugo finalists. This is our second to last episode in that series, and we will be talking with Novella finalists Tochi, Onyebuchi, and Nghi. We will finish this series off in 2 weeks on November 13th. Talking to Lindsay. Both novellas we're talking about today describe a history through short vignettes. As we move through the two stories, we see the impacts of the stereotypes and prejudices on the lives of the characters involved. And in both cases, we see movement from loss of power to reclaiming power. These two powerful novellas are strong contenders for this year's Hugo for Best Novelette.
And I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Tochi. We've got Tochi Onyebuchi with us today. Tochi majored in political science at Yale, as a lot of academic credentials as a Master of Fine Arts in Screenwriting from the NYU Tisch School, as well as a Master's in Global Economic Law from the Institut d'études politiques in France, which I don't know if I butchered that or not, but I did my best French accent for you, as well as a law degree from Columbia. Tochi was a civil rights lawyer for the New York State Attorney General's office, the NAMO Award winner for Beast Made of Night, and is nominated this year for Riot Baby. Already won the Alex Award and the Ignite Award. And we're so excited to have you with us today, Tochi.
Thank you so much for having me. Yeah.
How is your bookshelf is amazing. I really love the enormous Akira behind you.
That's one of my prized possessions. That is the 35th anniversary edition reissue of all 6 volumes of the original graphic novel, all in hardcover, retouched, relettered, recolored. It is I got it at my very first Comic-Con that I went to as a dude who wrote a thing in 2017, and it was like my first treat yourself purchase. And
yes, it sounds like it.
Oh, it's my pride and joy. Yes.
It's very noticeable. I've got nerd envy from here. Well, Tochi, thank you so much for being with us today. Alan, did we want to introduce No also?
We can go for that, yes. Our other guest today is Nghi. Nghi is a Hugo, Locus, and Ignite Award finalist, the winner of the Reddit Stabby and the IAFA's Crawford Award, is published in Strange Horizon, Lightspeed, and Uncanny, and is here for the nomination for the Empress of Salt and Fortune. Welcome.
Hello.
So we're going to start off the show by doing a short interview with Tochi, and then we're going to come back and interview Nghi, and then we'll bring them both in together and have a lot of fun talking about whatever comes up. I know a couple weeks back we were talking with Shannon, and we ended up talking about Hornets for a good long while, so I don't know if we're going to end up in any tangents like that, but anything there.
I don't know what about the Akira tangent we just went on made you think we've gotten better at avoiding tangents, but we'll do our best, Alan.
I didn't say we had to avoid them. I said anything goes. All right. So Nghi, we'll bring you back in a second. We're really glad to have you on the show. So Tochi, you had a career doing civil rights law before you started writing books. What took you? What bridged you from law into writing novels, and how did that happen?
I always knew that I was going to write, if not be a writer. Ever since I was a kid, it's there's no other single activity that brings me more joy, expands me, that makes me feel like I'm using as much of myself as possible as writing. It's the closest I've ever come to feeling like, oh, I'm using 100% of myself in this thing. My intellectual faculties, my emotional capabilities, my powers of articulation, my ways of sort of organizing the universe, my interpersonal skills, my understanding of people, all of that goes into storytelling. And so it was only a matter of figuring out what I was going to be writing around, because it's only actually recently that I got to the place emotionally where I felt comfortable being a writer as a living, especially growing up in a Nigerian household. It's, your 4 career options are doctor, lawyer, engineer, and disgrace to the family. So I figured, let me split the difference by going to law school while doing the writing thing. And for me, my whole governing philosophy is that nothing is wasted, right? So everything that I did in college, I was writing about, I was telling stories about. I would take political economy classes and write, crime novels and crime short stories that basically were demonstrations of concepts like sovereign debt and international capital mobility and migration flows. And that was how I made sense of these things. Film school, I got to do nothing but write. And then, in law school, I was writing about a lot of the stuff that I was learning in class. And so that was something that I took with me into the workforce. And so much of Riot Baby comes from my experience at the Attorney General's office and my subsequent experience with legal aid. At the Legal Aid Society, I basically lived on Rikers. And so much of what occurs in that section of Riot Baby is drawn from that experience.
I was going to say that it felt like that really tied in from the, all of the experiences Kev has, and talking both in the scenes when Ella's there in person as opposed to not in person, but there. And they have those conversations. It definitely felt like you definitely had seen what that system looked like and all of the different intricacies of things that could be involved there.
No, so, definitely. Yeah.
I'd love to hear more about how, your experience as a civil rights attorney influenced the topics, that you write about in Riot Baby. Like what were, how directly did you take some of these, examples almost, was it a fictionalization of various elements of things you'd experienced?
So I'm going to, in my response to this question, sort of reappropriate a term that has unfortunately been colonized by the more sort of insidious, parts of the internet. But I was essentially in law school was when I was sort of red pilled. At least that was where I got a larger understanding of racism and oppression as systemic, as opposed to individual acts or individual instances. It was in law school that I even learned what redlining was, for instance. It was in law school that I learned about the ways in which the criminal justice system, and particularly the carceral setup in America, is geared towards this racialized sort of subjugation. Up until then, I didn't necessarily see how it all worked in terms of systems. And that understanding, I think, is one of the things that got me to writing about the things that I wound up writing about, particularly with Riot Baby, but also to a certain extent with Goliath. In Riot Baby, the main antagonist is the system, right? And how do you write that? That was one of the biggest challenges with the book, was how do you write a book where the villain, so to speak, isn't a single person or single group of people. It's something in which an entire swath of society is implicated. And law school, I think, was where a lot of that change in thought happened for me. And this isn't to sort of valorize the way that legal education is set up or taught in the United States. It's actually very horrible, and in many ways reinforces a lot of the supremacist structures. Brett Kavanaugh is a product of the American legal education system. It's like that sort of thing. That's the type of person that law school, particularly the type of law school that I went to, is set up to create. But I was very fortunate to have, become friends with some really incredible people, really doing really noble work in public interest law. So whether it's direct legal services with people who are incarcerated or with migrants, whether it's with regards to women's rights, particularly access to contraceptives, and working for organizations that do targeted litigation there. I got to become friends with people who ended up like working on the initial lawsuits that basically became the strongest impediments to the initial Muslim ban under the Trump administration. So like I became friends with these incredible people. And once I was in that circle through osmosis, I basically like started to learn more of how the country functions and how so much of these systems are set up. And so I'm grateful every day to them because they have in many ways helped shape my writing career as it exists today.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely felt that Riot Baby took all of that and really looked at it from all angles. Like Riot Baby seems to be a real demonstration of all of the different ways that racism is institutionalized in American society, from the beginning to the end. I mean, it's like 2 pages from the end where you see the last example of how that institutionalization can be invisible, and how even if you feel like it's working towards your freedom, you're not.
Yeah, no, I mean it's that claustrophobia, right? Like I think it's one of the most terrifying things, particularly about existing as part of a marginalized population in the United States, is the idea that the terror is sort of everywhere. And that was a feeling that I very much felt in 2014, 2015, when there was this profusion of videographic evidence of police-involved shootings of African Americans. And it was like, you're not safe in your car, you're not safe in a Walmart, you're not safe in a public park. Like, look at how Tamir Rice spent his last moments. And so this sort of omnipresence of like it could happen at any moment, that I think was something that I wanted to carry into a work like Riot Baby, and also the demonstrating the claustrophobia and the fact that it's only like it's less than 200 pages, and so much of the story is happening in these very sort of closed and tight settings. But what you were talking about with regards to the pervasiveness of institutionalized racism was something that was definitely important for me to convey, so that it's not just the police, it's not just prisons, but it's even in the medical field. It's even in hospitals. And that ends up being a fulcrum of the story, is when Ella discovers some of her mom's history and some of what her mother has been through. That's the thing that like snaps her, and she's like, okay, like it's go time, like we gotta it's time to really get biblical.
Yeah, one of the things that like I really like about the way that this was put together is that it's not completely fictionalized in terms of its backdrop. It references some of these events by name, not just in our conversation now, but actually in the book, and so it feels very relevant, just in where it does step into just our immediate past.
It covers, I mean, it starts off and really covers that period that was formative in my lifetime, with the Rodney King riots and setting it there. It really felt present and really tied into what was really the first moment that in my timeline I realized that the racial systems were unequal, because in education I was taught basically that the civil rights movement happened, everything was okay now, but it wasn't. And the Rodney King riots really brought it front and center that these inequities weren't there, and that this anger is justified, and that we're not working towards getting there yet.
I mean, the Rodney King was maybe my first like political memory that I really like remember from that time as a kid. Like looking back, I think the things that really stood out in my head were, it was Rodney King, the Oklahoma City bombing, and like Nancy Kerrigan and Tanya Harding. And then OJ, like that, like in that, like, yeah, like those were like, that was the that was the context of my childhood. And of course, I don't know how to like process or make sense of any of this stuff. But when I was looking at Riot Baby and conceptualizing it and getting into the idea that not only is institutionalized racism pervasive in the present, but particularly within the sort of police and prison complex, it's got this sort of interminability, and that the same thing keeps happening over and over again. Rodney King was such a lodestone for me in that regard, because like for I think a lot of people of our generation, that was our first instance of this, this thing that's been on this historical continuum. And then to see this thing happen in, a very sort of accelerated and aggravated fashion in like 2013, 2014, 2015, where there is this sort of instantaneous nature of it, I think it was wild. It was wild. Like, for lack of a better word, it was wild to see like history repeating in so vicious a fashion, and in so and not just vicious in terms of the actual content of the events, but the immediacy with which these things are disseminated, or like video evidence of these things are disseminated. Like, I watched Philando Castile's final moments on Facebook like the day after it happened. And this was before Facebook like turned off autoplay. So I was just scrolling through my timeline at work, during my break, and like there it was. So yeah, no, it's been weird, and at the same time, like horrifically enlightening to place that on the same continuum as Rodney King.
Yeah,
Definitely. Well, I'm sorry to say that I think we're going to move on and talk to Niveau for a little bit, but we will talk to you again soon. And we'll bring you back up and all talk together at the end. Nghi, thank you for jumping back in.
Hello.
So your book, Empress of Salt and Fortune, right, deals with it's Chi, right?
Chi is the historian cleric. Yes,
is the historian that is going and investigating this site that the former Empress has been relegated to because of politics, because she's a foreigner from the north, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're experiencing this after the fact and talking about little vignettes of history. One of the things that I noticed in it is that each chapter, or each small vignette, was sort of preceded by the description of a couple objects, and that sort of framing of the story was really interesting. How did you come up with that, or is that what was your inspiration for that?
Basically came around because of the violence of museums, actually. One of the things that I grew up, being a huge fan of museums. Museums and libraries were basically my next to sacred spaces, more or less. And eventually, as I grew up and as I started, looking at the tags rather than just at the pretty pictures or the Paleolithic tools, there's such a small amount of information on a museum tag. There's so little there, and then we get into issues of provenance and how did an artifact come to be in a museum, and how utterly inadequate it is, and how much you can hide in simple words like such and such artifact pulled from Vietnam or Benin or any place like that. And how much that hides and how much it glosses over, and what happens if you look at the real history of how an item came to be so far from where it was made. And that's kind of the beginning. It's not where it ended, because the story has a slightly different focus than the idea of robbed goods, but that's where it began.
Yeah,
it makes a lot of sense. And also, you have such a good point about how it feels like there's a wealth of information in any museum exhibit, because there are a wealth of items and exhibits, but any one does not tell you very much about it at all.
No, I think every item, there's a kind of a material history that begs to be investigated, and we almost never do, because we're at a museum and there's a million exhibits to take in, and it's an education of a very certain type, and it's
Yeah.
maybe not the most accurate one we could have.
Absolutely.
So, she is going to continue into a couple other stories, right? The tiger comes down from the mountain, and a third one, right?
Yeah, that's Into the Riverlands.
Into the Riverlands. How does Chi's storytelling style change as we go through the different novellas?
Chi is a protagonist that sort of snuck up on me. They are a lot more good-natured and sweet and open to the world than almost anyone else I've ever written. And they're just going to carry that energy forward. They are curious. They are open to the world. They absolutely have their own prejudices. They're learning about the world even as they take down the histories as best they know how. And when it comes to viewpoint characters, I feel so very fortunate because on one hand I created Chi, and on the other hand, they were just the narrator that developed for the Empress of Salt and Fortune. Like, the idea for Chi is specifically, who do you want to hear your stories? And you could do worse than have someone like Chi.
I think
Sorry about that.
Since
Repeat,
we shared,
I got that.
Yeah, I think since we shared the cover.
Yeah, we shared the image. The audio looped a little bit. So if you mind saying that one more time.
Oh, sure. Chi came from the idea that if you have to have someone hear your stories, Chi would not be a terrible person to listen. They're sympathetic. They want your point of view, even if they don't necessarily agree with everything you say. And they're just going to continue making their way through the world, absorbing as many stories as they can, and just experiencing the world around them, which sounds wonderful sometimes. Not really all the time.
I wanted to ask, what interests you about the empire that you're writing about? Like, what do you draw on to make it feel so real?
A lot of it comes from the fact that I studied a fair amount of history while I was in undergrad. Some of it just comes from random science articles I've read or from funny things that people say. If there is an overarching to the cycle and to the Empress of Salt and Fortune, it's a resistance to overarching narratives that we are given by the people running things. I'm not going to go so far as to say that we're made of stories. That's too easy. It's an idea I've come to really dislike. But stories do shape the world we live in. Whether it's telling us who's responsible for our problems, or this is what you need to do to be a good person. And if there's anything that I've tried to take from the Empress of Salt and Fortune, it's the idea of being suspicious of the narratives that are pushed at you, especially when they swell to the size where they can preclude other narratives from being seen.
That makes a lot of sense. In terms of, structure, obviously these are novellas. What is your favorite, length to write? There's short stories, novels, novellas. Do you have a favorite?
So for a few years, I was doing a drabble a day, a drabble being a 100-word story. And I did about 500, 700 of those or so. So that one's probably my favorite because I'm just done. I feel like every word I have to write is just an imposition.
That's amazing. That's so many.
It's so many. Most of them are terrible. So yeah, I mean, there's that. But they're fast.
Yeah.
You do have a full-length novel coming out, right?
I do. Well, The Chosen and the Beautiful came out a few months ago, and I have Siren Queen coming out next year in May. Siren Queen was actually my first novel, the first one I'd ever written, and I believe my agent looked it over and said to me, she said something like, "This is just 3 novellas in a trench coat, right?" And I'm like, "Oh, you noticed?" And she's like, "Yes, yes, I noticed." So, there's only so far I get away from, that whole urge to be done as quickly as possible.
That feedback is always valuable when someone sees right through your trench coat.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's impressive because I know at the end of the Empress of Salt and Fire, I mean, Salt and anyways, brains, Salt and Fortune. I really wanted to see what was happening next, both in Chi's story, but also in the story of the Empress, and where that was going to go. That Rabbit was telling to Chi.
That's the funny part. Rabbit's done. Rabbit's done with all of this. She's out. She's moving on to something else fun. And one of the fun things about writing the Seeing Hills, which Tor.com was kind enough to basically sign up for 5 of them altogether so far. And that means I get to stretch things out, and I get to throw in the stuff that does happen to Inyo and to Rabbit, because they show up. They don't show up personally in any of the ones I've written yet, but they do show up in basically in their turbulence, in the effects and the waves of their motions. It's really fun.
All right. I think we're ready to bring Tochi back up and talk about some stuff together.
Sure.
So both of you are novella finalists for the Hugos, but you aren't just authors, you're also readers. Who else that has been nominated in other categories are you rooting for, or think are works that you would love to see win?
It's a hard one, isn't it?
We can lower the stakes and just say that you particularly liked and want to highlight.
I haven't had a lot of time to look at this slate as much as I would like to. I know that Sean Maguire's novellas are always a winner with me, and I'm really, and of course, Tochi's Riot Baby was amazing, and Ring Shout as well by P. Daly Clark. Those are fantastic.
Yeah, no, it's in terms of other categories. I mean, I'll say it's so dope to be writing and like being a professional in the genre like at this time. There's literally so much that's just like just rich and mind-bending about what's being published now and what's making it onto ballots. I mean, and also too, I think it's fascinating to see another Susanna Clark book like up, for like, it's like a Halley's Comet type thing. And so, that I think is really exciting to me. I mean, Ring Shout, I blurbed it. I love that book to death. Also too, like, the Fenderson's been whooping my butt on the award circuit so far.
You won the Ignite. What else do you want, man?
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, I all of which is to say, I would not mind at all losing a Hugo to him. But also like Present Company included. It speaks to the incredible vibrancy and color and robustness of the genre that all of them are deserving. All of them are deserving.
Yeah, we've had Jelly on our show a couple of times, and he's always such a delight to talk to. I right with you on Ring Shout.
Yeah, and it's not just me being diplomatic.
He was in on that conversation about Hornets the other week.
Wonderful.
Yeah. Let's see. What do you think about, we mentioned this before the show a little bit, the evolving nature of topics right now with pandemic behind us. People are starting to write about different things. What do you think are going to be some of the topics that you're interested in writing about, or that you think other people are going to be writing about as a result of the last 2 years?
Isolation would be my best guess. Both the isolation of being stuck in the house and the isolation of being utterly alone in a crowd. The fun realization that your employer doesn't care if you live or die. Yeah, I think that's going to be it. I think we're going to see a lot more fun Squid Game sort of pieces of media, or at least that's what I really want.
It's so funny too, because during a lot of the like very dark points in the pandemic, if you were talking with like network execs or producers or whatever, everybody was like, oh, we want something hopeful. Like if you were pitching a movie or a TV show, oh, we want something hopeful. We want something happy, something that'll lift people's spirits. And now Squid Game's the most popular show, like almost in the entire world. And now all the producers are like, yeah, let's get something super dark and gory and dystopian. Like that's what the people want. So I think in terms of actual creatives, one of the things that I think it's been interesting to observe during the pandemic is how, these really dark and constraining environments have pushed people to write the thing that they have wanted to write, but never felt necessarily that like the industry would accept or that, they would be able to find a place for. It's almost like a sort of like, you know what, life's too short. Let me just do the thing that I love to do. So I feel like what we might see, and this doesn't necessarily speak to the particular content, but and it's something that I hope we see, is a lot more like, this is the book of my heart type of stuff, from writers. Like I really want to see more and more of that. Like, this is the thing that I've wanted to write for like a decade. And I finally was like, screw it, I'm going to write this thing. And like, now it's like, out or being queried or like being shopped around. Like that's something that I want to see. I want to see books that are like, I don't know, this sounds like a weird word, but like dangerous, right? And I say that with this specific caveat, right? Like I want to see dangerous books from like people like us, like people like me and Nghi. Like I want to see like edgy books from basically the children and grandchildren of empire. Good friend Rebecca Kwong recently announced that she had sold a literary novel provisionally titled Yellowface, that gets into all sorts of incredibly knotty issues of like identity and publishing and appropriation and credit. And it's so meaty, right? Like that, just like talking about it. And that's like the type of thing that I want to see, the type of thing that's like, that normally you'd be like, I don't know if the world's ready or like the industry's ready. Like I want to see more FU books.
We're ready to go beyond 101, basically.
Yes, yeah. Exactly.
I do think we are ready to go beyond 101 at this point. I think that the stage has been set. The books that have led us there are out, and anybody who needs to educate themselves, there's plenty of 101 level stuff available to read. It is time to dig into the details. Get people, like you were saying, you didn't see the institutionalized nature of these systems until you got to law school. Be able to have that in our novels so that people reading just have a sense of it intuitively already. That would be wonderful.
And honestly, the Hugos have been doing a really good job of highlighting interesting, meaty work like this over the last couple years. We've had Hugo nominees on the show for 2 years now. This started as our pandemic project, and I could not have picked a more interesting group of people to talk to and more interesting works, across 2 years, really. You can't actually read the Hugo nominated works anymore without encountering these issues. I remember, I think it was like the novellas last year. I was like, they're the only romantic relationships in any of these, all of the novellas, the entire category are very queer and unusual, relationships. Like there's nothing standard to be found. I think it was the novellas. I don't remember which category it was. I see you frowning at me, Alan. So
I'm frowning because you said unusual. I'm not sure that queer relationships are unusual.
Oh, is it queer or unusual? I am queer.
Right. Okay.
Or unusual, so because they were very high concept in some ways. Yeah, I put aliens into that category, maybe. Right. Thank you for the clarification.
That makes more sense.
Yeah, but just that it's been a really rich body of work.
So, let's see. We've talked about institutionalized racism, but we haven't talked as much about novels on imperialism, because to some extent, Empress of Salt and Fortune is taking on the concept of imperialism, right? One culture dominating another culture, and looking at that interaction, and how those stereotypes and inequities cause different people to be marginalized. Are there any other books that you would recommend on examining that are out right now?
This is going backward rather than forward, but Jin Young's The Hero and the Sword, which is sort of the granddaddy of wuxia novels, is kind of newly out in English translation. And I mean, on one hand, it's martial arts, off the wall, fantastic. Everyone meets up in an inn and suddenly we're all kicking ass sort of novels. But that one takes on a lot of structure, and it takes on a lot of dominant narratives and competing narratives. And it's a really good reminder that, history doesn't repeat, but it will rhyme if you don't stop it from doing so.
What was the title of that again?
You know what? I'm just going to look here because I think I have my copy. Oh, why am I so bad at this?
So Tochi, I think you covered some of that in some of your young adult novels as well, right? Like East Made of Night deals with similar.
Yeah, no, it's interesting too, because in Beasts and Crown, there isn't necessarily the same connotation of externally imposed imperial dynamics, but there is that same sort of social stratification that is at work. And then you see a sort of genre of that with War Girls, particularly when you get into the issue of interethnic conflict and tribal warfare. That was very much a feature of the actual Biafran War in Nigeria from 1967 to 1970. And so, readers definitely read those. I highly recommend them. I think they're very good books. But also too, in terms of, I think, getting a very interesting and I would say sort of deep understanding of imperialism. I'm going to nerd out a little bit and recommend some stuff that's kind of outside the box. Nothing Ever Dies by Viet Thanh Nguyen is one of the dopest books that I've ever read on, not just the Vietnam War from the perspective of various Southeast Asians who experienced it, but also the appropriation of memory, the whole memory industrial complex that Hollywood engages in, where you see all these Vietnam War movies told from the perspective of American soldiers. And it's all about what Americans endured there, as opposed to the absolute horrific, just apocalypse that they visited on that entire part of the world. And so Nothing Ever Dies by Viet Thanh Nguyen, I think, is an incredible examination of American imperialism and the way in which it infiltrates things like memory and idea propagation and basically the just colonization of lived experience. I'd also recommend, and of course, Orientalism by Edward Said. That's an incredible touchstone that I think is so foundational to so much of my own writing and my own understanding of the world. But also two more recent books that I would recommend that get into a little bit more of the sort of individualized lived experience of people operating in that liminal space between the sort of colony and the metropole, so to speak, would be Minor Feelings by Kathy Park Hong and Conditional Citizen by Leila Lalami. Those two books, and both of which are out in paperback, if that's your preferred format. Both of them are incredible in speaking to the individual lived experience of people from formerly colonized places or places that had been subject to imperialism by Western powers, existing in the sort of United Statesian context in the present day. And what do microaggressions look like in that format? What does it look like for your citizenship to quite literally be conditional? I think those books, so Nothing Ever Dies, Orientalism, Conditional Citizens, and Minor Feelings, those would be the four books that I recommend to anyone that really wants to dig into, okay, what are all the different ways in which imperialism can manifest itself in the lives of, the people who experienced it.
Nghi, do you have that book that you wanted to share?
I found it, yes. The series is called Legends of the Condor Heroes, and as I was looking at my shelf, I'm like, oh wait, Interior Chinatown by Charles Yu is also fantastic.
Yes.
It was the coolest thing I had read. Wasn't it great?
It's so good.
It's so weird and cool. It's basically the idea of being a Chinese American actor, and the whole thing is told in script format, and it's about the roles that you can take and the roles your whole family or your community can take, and it's weird, and it is just the coolest. So
and what was the name of that one, just one more time?
That one's Interior Chinatown. I was super excited. Okay, you felt the same way about it too, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like, honestly, this is selling like,
it was delightful.
Your
it was utterly
enthusiasm
delightful.
is absolutely echoing.
It was amazing. Like I think me describing her reaction to it is very much like what my reaction was to it. Like format wise, it's incredible. And it's one of those books too, wherein the format is so perfectly married to the content. Like the idea of literally the roles that you can play as a Chinese American person in like American media, but told in a screenplay format. Like it's just how does that occur to you to do as a writer?
And the intersection of oppression and the weird genre skip. The genre skip just did my head in. I was like, yes, that's exactly right. We're all living in different genres.
So good.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for the Rex. I've certainly got a bunch of new browser tabs open with books I can
That's
buy.
our syllabus. That's the syllabus
that is
Nghi and I
definitely
have
a
put together
syllabus
for y'all.
All right. So
let's see. I would say it looks like we're just about starting to wrap up, and so as a last question, I would just say, do either of you have anything coming up that you would like to plug?
I've got Siren Queen, which is a story of 1930s Hollywood meets Fairyland in May, and at the end of the year, I've got Into the Riverlands, which is the third Singing Hills book, once again with Chi and Almost Brilliant.
Cool.
So looking forward to those. Tochi?
So 2 projects, Black Panther Legends, which is a book that I'm doing with Marvel, which sort of retells the origin story of Black Panther by digging into T'Challa's childhood, his adolescence in Wakanda. What is it like for him to grow up as part of this family in the specific geopolitical context of the African continent at the time? And upcoming from Tor.com in January of 2022, Goliath, which paradoxically enough is my adult debut novel, which sounds weird to say because it's like my 7th book, but it's the first full-length adult novel that I will be publishing. It's the best thing I've ever written. That's really the biggest endorsement that I could give of it. I snapped when I wrote that book. So I can't wait for it to be in y'all's hands.
Oh, so exciting.
Yeah. Looking forward to that one. All right. Well, thank you guys for joining us. As I said at the beginning of the show, in 2 weeks, we're going to have Lindsay Ellis on to talk about her books. Specifically, she was nominated for, gosh, I was just reading it, but I started reading the second one, and the names all got mixed up in my head. But anyways, she'll be here, and we'll be interviewing her about those books which deal with first contact, which is another interesting concept that deals with a lot of potential for oppression. This has been Essence of Wonder, again without Gadi Evron, and we'll see you next week, or in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much.